You're just expired goods now, Elizabeth. Nobody wants what you're selling anymore. The words sliced through the warm dining room air like a blade, and I felt my fork freeze halfway to my mouth. There I was, 62 years old, sitting at my own mahogany table where I'd served Sunday dinners for decades, watching my daughter-in-law Jessica's glossed lips curl into that calculated smile. My son George, my own son, just kept cutting his pot roast, pretending he hadn't heard his wife call his mother worthless garbage. But he had heard. We all had heard. And in that crystalline moment of silence, with the grandfather clock ticking in the corner and 10-year-old Tommy chattering about homework upstairs, everything I thought I knew about my family shattered like fine china hitting concrete. I set down my fork with deliberate precision. "Excuse me." "Oh, don't be dramatic, Elizabeth," Jessica said, waving her hand dismissively. "I'm just being honest. You're at that age where society doesn't really value what older women have to offer anymore. It's not personal. It's just reality." David finally looked up from his plate, but his eyes darted between us nervously. "Jessica, maybe we could." "Could what?" she interrupted. "Pretend that Elizabeth isn't becoming a burden? Pretend that she's still the capable woman she was 20 years ago." Jessica's voice carried that syrupy sweetness that made my skin crawl. "Honey, we're family. We should be able to speak honestly about these things. People always think these family betrayals happen all at once, like someone just snaps one day and suddenly there's chaos everywhere. But the truth is, these things build up over years, layer by layer, like sediment at the bottom of a river. You don't notice how deep the muck has gotten until someone stirs it all up, and you see just how filthy the water really is. That Sunday evening in October, as I sat there watching Jessica, my daughter-in-law of 8 years, casually destroy what was left of my dignity while my son pretended not to hear, I realized I'd been drowning in that muck for far too long. But expired goods? Really? Let me tell you something about being a widow at my age. Robert and I had been together for 38 years. We'd built a good life, a comfortable life. He was a civil engineer, worked his way up to partner at a respected firm downtown, and I'd spent 25 years as a high school English teacher before taking early retirement to care for his mother in her final years. We'd raised George together, put him through college, watched him marry Jessica, celebrated when they gave us our grandson Tommy. We owned our home outright, a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial in Maplewood that Robert and I had bought when George was just 3 years old. We had savings, investments, a solid retirement plan. Robert had made sure I'd be taken care of, and I was grateful for that foresight every single day. But somehow, in the years since his death, I'd let myself become smaller. I'd let George and Jessica make more and more decisions about my life, telling me what was best for me, what made sense for a woman my age. Started small, the way these things always do. Jessica suggesting I shouldn't drive at night anymore after I got a little turned around coming home from book club one evening. George insisting I should let them handle my finances since money stuff was complicated and I'd never had to deal with it alone before. Jessica again recommending I sell the house and move into a nice little apartment somewhere. Nothing too big, nothing too much trouble to maintain. Looking back now, I can see how carefully they orchestrated it all. How every suggestion was wrapped in concern for my well-being. Every recommendation framed as loving advice from family who just wanted what was best for me. And I went along with it because that's what mothers do, isn't it? We put our children first. We trust that their love for us means their advice comes from a good place. We assume that the people we've raised and sacrificed for would never deliberately take advantage of our grief and vulnerability. God, I was naive. The dinner that Sunday had started like all our Sunday dinners over the past few years. George would pick me up around 4. I'd stop driving myself after one too many lectures about reflexes and night vision, and we'd go to their house for what Jessica liked to call family time. Jessica would cook, though it was usually something simple that required minimal effort on her part, and we'd eat in their formal dining room while 10-year-old Tommy told us about school and his friends and whatever video game was currently consuming his attention. I'd bring dessert, usually something homemade that I'd spent half the afternoon preparing, and we'd sit around afterward while Jessica cleared the table and George helped Tommy with homework. It was pleasant enough, I suppose, though I always felt like I was visiting rather than being part of the family. Like I was a guest who'd been invited out of obligation rather than genuine desire for my company. Still, it was time with my son and grandson, and after 5 years of eating dinner alone most nights, I treasured those few hours each week when I felt connected to something larger than myself. That particular Sunday, Jessica had made pot roast with carrots and potatoes. Nothing fancy but filling and warm. Tommy had been especially animated, telling us about a science project he was working on about renewable energy sources, and I'd been genuinely enjoying listening to his excitement about wind turbines and solar panels. George seemed relaxed too, laughing at Tommy's enthusiasm and asking thoughtful questions about the project. For a moment, it felt like the kind of family dinner I'd imagined we'd have for years to come. Then Tommy excused himself to finish his homework, and the conversation shifted. Jessica started talking about their neighbor Mrs. Chun, an elderly woman who'd recently moved into a retirement community after her children convinced her she could no longer live safely on her own. "It's really for the best," Jessica said, cutting her meat with precise, delicate movements. She was becoming such a burden on her family, calling them every time she had a little problem with the house or couldn't figure out her television remote. Her son told George it was getting exhausting, having to rush over there every few days to help with something. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, but I kept eating, kept my expression neutral. I'd heard this song before. Plus, Jessica continued, not looking at me directly but somehow making it clear her words were intended for my ears, the house was just too much for her. All those stairs, that big yard, all the maintenance and upkeep. What does a woman her age need with a 4-bedroom house anyway? It's just wasteful, really. Selfish when you think about younger families who could actually use that space. George nodded along, still focused on his dinner. Makes sense, he agreed. No point rattling around in a house that's too big for you. Better to be somewhere safe, somewhere you don't have to worry about all the responsibilities of homeownership. I set down my fork and looked at my son, really looked at him. When had he become this stranger sitting across from me? When had the little boy who used to crawl into my lap after nightmares become this man who could sit there and discuss my future like I wasn't even present? The retirement community is lovely, Jessica added, her tone bright and cheerful as if she were discussing vacation plans. They have activities and meal plans, and there's always staff available if there's an emergency. Much more appropriate for someone of a certain age than trying to maintain independence in a situation that's clearly becoming unmanageable. That's when I made my mistake. I opened my mouth. I manage my house just fine, I said quietly, trying to keep my voice level. I've lived there for 35 years. It's my home. Jessica's smile sharpened, and she set down her own fork with a small clink against the plate. Oh, Elizabeth, of course you think you're managing fine. But that's exactly the problem, isn't it? People your age don't always have the best judgment about what they can actually handle anymore. It's not your fault, it's just natural aging. Your reflexes aren't what they used to be, your memory isn't as sharp, your physical capabilities are declining. It's nothing to be ashamed of, but it is something to be realistic about. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but I tried to stay calm. My memory is perfectly fine, thank you. And I've been maintaining that house just fine for the 5 years since your father-in-law died. Have you, though? Jessica's voice was still sweet, still concerned, but there was something sharp underneath it now. Because George's had to come over how many times in the past few months to help with little things? The garbage disposal, that issue with the back porch light, moving those boxes in the basement. George looked uncomfortable now, shifting in his seat. Mom, she's not wrong. You have been calling more often lately. I called twice, I said, looking directly at my son. Twice in 3 months. The garbage disposal was genuinely broken and needed to be repaired. And I wanted help moving some of your father's heavier things that I've been putting off dealing with. That hardly constitutes evidence of declining capabilities. Jessica laughed, a light, tinkling sound that somehow managed to be condescending and dismissive at the same time. See? This is exactly what I mean. You don't even realize how often you need help, because you've convinced yourself you're still the same capable woman you were 20 years ago. But honey, reality is reality, and the reality is that you're just not that woman anymore. She leaned forward slightly, and I could see the calculation in her eyes, the way she was choosing her words carefully to land the maximum impact. You're just expired goods now, Elizabeth. Nobody wants what you're selling anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, could hear Tommy's voice upstairs talking to himself as he worked on his homework, Could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. George was staring at his plate like it contained the secrets of the universe, his jaw tight but his mouth firmly shut. Jessica picked up her fork again and took another bite of pot roast, as casual as if she'd just commented on the weather. I sat there for a long moment, feeling something shift inside me like tectonic plates realigning. Expired goods. That's what she thought of me. Not a woman who'd raised the man she was married to. Not someone who'd spent decades contributing to her community and her family. Not a human being deserving of basic respect and dignity. Just expired goods. Worthless. Used up. Ready for disposal. The thing that struck me most wasn't even the cruelty of it, though it was undeniably cruel. It was the calculation. The deliberate choice to say something so designed to wound, so carefully crafted to make me feel small and worthless and ashamed. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a comment that slipped out in anger. This was strategic. And my son who I'd carried for 9 months, nursed through countless childhood illnesses, driven to soccer practice and piano lessons in friends' houses, helped with homework and college applications and job interviews, my son who I'd loved unconditionally for 33 years, my son said nothing. I finished the bite that was already in my mouth, chewed slowly and swallowed. Then I set down my fork, placed my napkin beside my plate, and looked directly at Jessica. "Thank you for dinner," I said, my voice steady and calm. It was very illuminating. I stood up and walked to the front hall to get my purse and coat. Jessica called after me, her voice suddenly bright and confused, as if she couldn't imagine what might have upset me. "Elizabeth? Where are you going? We haven't had dessert yet." I didn't answer. I called a taxi from my phone. Yes, I was perfectly capable of using a smartphone, thank you very much, and waited on their front porch until it arrived. George came out just as the car was pulling up, looking awkward and uncomfortable. "Mom, come on. You know she didn't mean anything by it. That's just how Jessica talks. She's got a dry sense of humor. You know that." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be better than this, and felt something cold and final settle in my chest. "No, George," I said quietly. "I don't know that. And neither do you." The ride home was quiet, just me and the taxi driver who was kind enough not to pry into why a woman my age was calling for a ride from her own family's house on a Sunday evening. I tipped him well and walked up the front steps to my house, the one I'd supposedly lost the ability to maintain, and let myself in. The house felt different that night. Not empty exactly because it had felt empty plenty of times over the past 5 years, but changed somehow like I was seeing it with new eyes. I walked through the room slowly, really looking at everything. The hardwood floors Robert and I had refinished ourselves the summer George graduated college. The kitchen we'd renovated 10 years ago, with cabinets I'd picked out and countertops we'd spent weeks choosing. The living room where we'd hosted countless family gatherings and birthday parties and holiday celebrations. This was my home. Not just the place where I lived, but the place where I'd built a life. Every corner held memories. Every room told part of the story of who I was and who I'd been. The idea that I should give it up, should accept being shuffled off to some sterile retirement community because it was more appropriate for someone my age, suddenly seemed not just wrong but actively insulting. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in Robert's old chair by the window, looking out at the garden we'd planned together. The rose bushes were dormant now in the October chill, but I could see where I'd need to prune them come spring. The maple tree in the corner was dropping its leaves, creating a carpet of red and gold that would need to be raked soon. These were not burdens. These were parts of a life I'd chosen and built and earned. Expired goods. The phrase kept echoing in my mind, but instead of making me feel small, it was making me angry. A slow, simmering rage that started somewhere deep in my chest and spread outward like warmth from a furnace. How dare she? How dare this woman who'd married into my family 8 years ago? This woman who'd never worked a day outside the home, who'd never raised a child from birth to adulthood, who'd never lost a husband or learned to navigate grief and rebuilding. How dare she sit in her dining room and pronounce judgment on my worth? And how dare my son sit there and let her do it? I went to bed that night with my mind churning, but I slept better than I had in months, because for the first time in years I wasn't questioning myself or my capabilities or my value. I was questioning them. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt since before Robert died. I made coffee, ate breakfast, And then I did something I hadn't done in months. I went down to the basement and retrieved the box of financial documents I'd let George and Jessica convince me I shouldn't worry about anymore. It took me most of the morning to go through everything, but what I found was both reassuring and infuriating. Reassuring because my finances were in excellent shape, better than I'd even realized. Robert had been conservative with our investments but smart, and despite the market fluctuations of the past few years, our portfolio had grown considerably. The house was worth nearly twice what we'd paid for it 3 decades ago. I had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life without ever touching the principal. What was infuriating was realizing how much control I'd handed over without any real justification. George had been managing my investment accounts for 2 years now, making decisions about my money without consulting me. Not maliciously necessarily, but certainly paternalistically, as if I were a child who couldn't be trusted with her own financial decisions. I spent the afternoon making phone calls, first to the investment firm where George had moved my accounts, requesting that control be transferred back to me immediately. The representative was professional and helpful, and within an hour I had access to everything again. Then I called my insurance company, my bank, and my attorney. Yes, I had my own attorney, thank you very much, not just the family lawyer George had been encouraging me to use. By evening, I had a complete picture of my financial situation and, more importantly, complete control over it again. I also had something else, a plan. The next few days were busy ones. I met with my attorney, Eleanor Whitman, a sharp woman about my age who'd been handling my personal legal matters since before Robert died. Eleanor listened to my concerns about my family's increasing attempts to manage my life and made some interesting observations. "Elizabeth," she said, leaning back in her leather chair and studying me over her reading glasses, "you need to understand something. What you're describing isn't just family concern. It's a pattern I see more often than I'd like, especially with widows who have substantial assets. Sometimes it's motivated by genuine love and misguided protectiveness. Sometimes it's motivated by other things entirely." She pulled out a file and opened it on her desk. "You own your house outright, correct? Worth approximately $800,000 in today's market. You have investment accounts worth just over $12 million. You receive Robert's pension and Social Security, plus your own teacher's retirement. Your annual income is approximately $90,000, and your annual expenses are roughly $40,000. You're not just financially secure, Elizabeth. You're wealthy." I sat back in my chair, absorbing this information. I'd never thought of myself as wealthy exactly. Comfortable, yes. Secure, certainly. But Eleanor was right. By most standards, I was indeed a wealthy woman. "Now," Eleanor continued, "I want you to think about something. If something were to happen to you, if you were to become incapacitated or die, who inherits your assets?" "George," I said automatically. "Everything goes to George." "And who is George married to?" "Jessica." The penny was starting to drop. "And if you were to move into a retirement community, as they've been suggesting, what would happen to your house?" "I suppose I'd have to sell it to pay for the care facility." My voice sounded strange to my own ears. Eleanor nodded. "And those proceeds would become part of your estate, which would eventually go to George and, by extension, Jessica. Meanwhile, your monthly expenses would increase dramatically. Quality retirement communities cost anywhere from $5,000 to $8,000 a month, which would mean you'd be spending down your savings much more quickly." She closed the file and looked at me directly. "I'm not saying your family has ulterior motives, Elizabeth, but I am saying that their suggestions would result in them inheriting your wealth much sooner, and in much smaller amounts than if you continue living independently and managing your own affairs." I left Eleanor's office with a lot to think about and several documents to review. She'd also given me the contact information for a private investigator. "Just in case," she'd said, "you want to know more about how your assets have been managed while they've been out of your direct control." That evening I called George. I kept my voice calm and pleasant, just a mother calling to check on her son. "Hi, honey. I wanted to apologize for leaving so abruptly last night. I wasn't feeling well and probably should have handled it better." George sounded relieved. "Oh, Mom, don't worry about it. We were just concerned about you. Jessica feels terrible about whatever upset you." "I bet she does," I thought, but I kept my voice level. "I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding. Listen, I've been thinking about what you both said about the house and my finances, and I think you might be right that I should be more realistic about my situation." "Really?" George's voice perked up with what sounded like genuine pleasure. "That's great, Mom. I think you'll find it's really liberating not to have to worry about all those details anymore." "I'm sure I will. I was wondering, though, if you could send me copies of the statements from my investment accounts for the past 2 years? I'd like to see how things have been going, just so I feel informed about the decisions that are being made." There was a small pause. "Mom, you don't need to worry about that stuff. That's exactly why I'm handling it for you. Trust me, everything's fine." "Oh, I'm sure it is. I just want to see for myself, you know? It would make me feel better to understand what's happening with my money." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll see what I can do. The statements are pretty complicated, though. You might find them confusing." Confusing? As if I hadn't been reading financial statements for the past 40 years. As if I were a child who couldn't understand her own money. "I'm sure I'll be fine," I said, keeping my voice light. "I am a college graduate after all." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time thinking. George's reluctance to share information about my own accounts was telling, and not in a good way. Combined with Eleanor's observations about the financial implications of their suggestions, a picture was starting to emerge that I didn't like at all. The next day, I met with the private investigator Eleanor had recommended. His name was James Morrison, and he was a former police detective who now specialized in financial investigations. He was professional and thorough, and he explained exactly what he could and couldn't do legally to examine how my accounts had been managed. "I can't access your accounts directly," he explained, "but I can look at patterns of activity, fee structures, transaction timing, that sort of thing. If there's been any mismanagement or inappropriate activity, it would show up in those patterns." I gave him all the account information I had and authorization to conduct his investigation. Then I went home and waited. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, James called and asked to meet with me again. This time, his expression was serious. "Elizabeth," he said, spreading papers across his desk, "I need to show you some things." What he showed me made my blood run cold. For the past 2 years, since George had taken over managing my accounts, there had been a pattern of what James called aggressive trading that had cost me nearly $200,000 in unnecessary fees and poorly timed transactions. Money that should have been growing in conservative, stable investments had been moved repeatedly into higher risk, higher fee investments that benefited the investment company far more than they benefited me. "It's not technically illegal," James explained, "but it's certainly not in your best interest. Someone who understood investment management would never structure a portfolio this way for a woman in your situation." But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what James had discovered when he'd looked into George and Jessica's financial situation. "Again," James said carefully, "I'm not saying there's been any deliberate fraud, but the pattern of behavior, encouraging you to increase your monthly expenses by moving to a retirement community, while simultaneously managing your investments in a way that depletes your assets more quickly, it's concerning." I sat in my car in James's parking lot for 20 minutes after our meeting, just trying to process everything I'd learned. My son, the child I'd raised to be honest and responsible and caring, had been mismanaging my money for 2 years. Whether intentionally or through simple incompetence didn't really matter, the result was the same. He'd cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars while simultaneously pressuring me to make decisions that would cost me hundreds of thousands more. And Jessica, who called me expired goods while plotting to inherit my assets as quickly as possible. That evening I made a decision. I called Eleanor. "I want to change my will," I said without preamble. "And I want to explore what legal options I have regarding the mismanagement of my investments." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure, Elizabeth? These kinds of family disputes can get very ugly very quickly." "I'm sure," I said, and I was. "They've been treating me like I'm already dead, like I'm just an inconvenience standing between them and their inheritance. Well, they're about to find out just how alive I really am." The next week was a whirlwind of legal appointments and financial reorganizations. Eleanor helped me draft a new will that established a charitable trust with the bulk of my assets, leaving George a modest inheritance that would be enough to help with his debts but not enough to solve all his problems. The rest would go to causes I cared about, education, literacy programs, support for widows and elderly women. I also consulted with a financial recovery specialist about pursuing compensation for the losses George's mismanagement had caused. It would mean taking legal action against my own son, but the alternative was letting him continue to treat my assets as his personal piggy bank. Most importantly, I took back control of my life in every way I could think of. I started driving myself again, despite their lectures about reflexes and night vision. I made appointments to have some long overdue maintenance done on the house, projects I'd been putting off because George and Jessica kept telling me it wasn't worth investing in repairs when I'd be moving soon anyway. I even started looking into some volunteer opportunities and social activities I'd been avoiding since Robert died. For the first time in 5 years, I felt like myself again. 2 weeks after that disastrous Sunday dinner, I called George and Jessica and invited them over for what I told them would be an important family discussion. They arrived Sunday afternoon looking pleased and expectant, probably assuming I was finally ready to announce my decision to sell the house and move into assisted living. They settled into the living room, Jessica perching on the edge of the sofa like she was trying not to get too comfortable in what she probably considered my temporary accommodations. George sat in his father's old chair, which bothered me more than I cared to admit. I've been doing a lot of thinking since our last dinner. I began, my voice calm and measured. You were right, Jessica. That I needed to be more realistic about my situation. Jessica smiled, that same self-satisfied expression she'd worn when she called me expired goods. I'm so glad you're seeing reason, Elizabeth. This is really for the best. Oh, I'm sure it is, I agreed. For someone anyway. I pulled out a folder of documents and set it on the coffee table between us. I've been reviewing my financial situation very carefully, and I've discovered some interesting things. George shifted uncomfortably. Mom, I told you you don't need to worry about that stuff. I've got it handled. Yes, you certainly have had it handled, I said, opening the folder and removing James's investigation report. In fact, you've handled it so well that I've lost approximately $200,000 in unnecessary fees and poor investment choices over the past 2 years. The color drained from George's face. That's not. I mean, the market has been volatile, and... The market has been volatile, I agreed. But the portfolio you structured for me was designed to maximize fees and commissions, not to protect my assets. I had it reviewed by an independent financial specialist. Jessica was looking back and forth between George and me, her mouth slightly open. I don't understand. What are you saying? I'm saying that the advice I've been getting about my finances and my living situation hasn't been in my best interest. It's been in yours. I pulled out another document. I also learned some interesting things about your financial situation. The second mortgage, the credit card debt, George's business troubles. Suddenly your concern about my wasteful use of space in this house makes more sense. It's hard to wait for an inheritance when you need money right now. George stood up abruptly. Mom, that's not fair. Yes, we've had some financial challenges, but that has nothing to do with our concern for your well-being. Doesn't it? I stood up too, and I could feel that cold steel in my voice that used to make my students sit up and pay attention. Because from where I sit, it looks like you've been managing my money poorly while encouraging me to make decisions that would force me to spend down my assets much more quickly. That's quite a coincidence. Jessica's voice was shrill now. This is ridiculous. We've been trying to help you. You're an elderly woman living alone in a house that's too big for you, trying to manage finances you don't understand. We've been protecting you from yourself. Protecting me? I laughed, and it wasn't a nice sound. Jessica, you called me expired goods. You told me I was worthless, that nobody wanted what I had to offer. That's not protection. That's abuse. She flinched like I'd slapped her. I never said that. You're twisting my words. I'm quoting them exactly. I pulled out my phone. Should I play you the recording? I was bluffing. I hadn't recorded anything. But the look of panic that crossed her face told me everything I needed to know. She'd said exactly what I remembered, and she knew it. George was staring at his wife like he'd never seen her before. Jessica, you didn't actually call her that, did you? The silence stretched out for a long moment before Jessica lifted her chin defiantly. I may have used some unfortunate phrasing, but my point was valid. Elizabeth is not capable of making rational decisions about her life anymore. And someone needs to step in before she makes a mistake that hurts everyone. The only mistake I made, I said quietly, was trusting you to have my best interests at heart. I pulled out the final document, the one that was going to hurt the most. This is my new will. Since you're so concerned about my decision-making capabilities, I thought you should know that I've decided to leave the bulk of my estate to charity. The Elizabeth and Robert Patterson Foundation for Educational Excellence will receive this house and the majority of my investments. George, you'll inherit enough to pay off your debts and give you a fresh start, but not enough to fund the lifestyle you seem to think you're entitled to. George's face went white. Mom, you can't be serious. I'm perfectly serious. I'm also withdrawing the power of attorney I granted you 2 years ago and resuming full control of my financial affairs. And I'll be changing the locks on this house, since I understand Jessica has been telling people she'll be redecorating it once I move out. Jessica shot to her feet, her composure finally cracking completely. You can't do this. This is our family home. Tommy's inheritance. This is my home, I said, my voice rising for the first time. Mine. I earned it, I paid for it, I maintained it, and I'll decide what happens to it. Tommy will inherit what I choose to leave him, when I choose to leave it, not what you've decided you're entitled to. George was shaking his head, looking lost and confused. Mom, I don't understand. We were trying to help you. Maybe I made some mistakes with the investments, but I was learning as I went. I never meant to cost you money. Maybe you didn't, I said, and I felt genuinely sad for him. But intent doesn't undo damage, George. And the fact that you never once asked me what I wanted, never considered that I might have opinions about my own life, never treated me like an adult capable of making her own decisions, that tells me everything I need to know about how much you actually respect me. Jessica was pacing now, her voice getting higher and more frantic. This is insane. You're a lonely old woman who's been living in this house like a hermit for 5 years. We're the only family you have left, and you're going to throw us away over what? Some hurt feelings. I'm going to reclaim my life, I said calmly. And if that means throwing away people who see me as nothing more than an obstacle between them and my money, then so be it. I walked to the front door and opened it. I think it's time for you to leave. George looked like he wanted to say something else, but Jessica was already grabbing her purse and heading for the door, her face flushed with anger and something that looked like panic. You'll regret this, she said as she pushed past me. When you're sitting in this house all alone with no one to take care of you, you'll regret pushing away the only people who cared about you. Jessica, I said, my voice perfectly calm. I spent 38 years being cared for by someone who actually loved me. I know the difference. After they left, I sat in my quiet house for a long time just breathing. Part of me felt sad about how everything had ended, about the relationship with my son that might never recover from this confrontation. But mostly I felt free. The next few months were challenging in some ways, as I adjusted to truly living independently again, rather than just existing in my house like a temporary resident. But they were also some of the most rewarding months I'd had since Robert died. I joined a book club at the local library, started volunteering at a literacy program for adult learners, and even began taking a watercolor painting class that I'd been interested in for years, but never had the confidence to try. I also started dating again, something I never thought I'd do. Richard was a retired history professor I met at the library, a widower about my age who treated me like an intelligent, interesting woman rather than a burden to be managed. We took things slowly, but it was wonderful to remember what it felt like to be valued for who I was rather than what I owned. George called a few times over the winter, awkward conversations where he clearly wanted to repair our relationship, but wasn't quite sure how to acknowledge what had happened. I was polite but distant. Trust, once broken, doesn't mend easily, and I wasn't ready to pretend everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Jessica, predictably, made several attempts to convince other family members that I was suffering from dementia, or some other cognitive decline that explained my irrational behavior. Most of our relatives saw through her manipulations fairly quickly, especially once they spent time with me and realized I was sharper and more engaged than I'd been in years. The most satisfying moment came about 6 months later, when Eleanor called to tell me that George and Jessica were divorcing. Apparently, the financial pressure of their debt combined with the realization that the inheritance they'd been counting on wasn't coming had put too much strain on their marriage. George had also discovered some other instances of Jessica's manipulation and dishonesty that he couldn't overlook once his eyes were opened. "He's asking if he can see you," Eleanor told me. "He wants to apologize and try to rebuild your relationship. No mention of money or the will. Just a son who misses his mother and realizes he made some serious mistakes." I thought about it for a long time before I called him back. When I did, we met at a neutral location, a small cafe downtown, and talked for 3 hours. George was genuinely remorseful, not just about the financial mismanagement but about the way he dismissed my autonomy and treated me like a child. He acknowledged that he'd been influenced by Jessica's attitude toward me, but he didn't try to use that as an excuse. He owned his choices and their consequences. "I kept telling myself I was protecting you," he said, staring into his coffee cup like it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "But I think I was really protecting myself from having to see you as anything other than my mother who needed taking care of. It was easier than accepting that you're a complete person with your own wants and needs and capabilities." That conversation was the beginning of a slow rebuilding process between us. George started therapy to work through his issues with guilt and control, and gradually we began to find our way back to something that resembled a healthy adult relationship. It wasn't the same as it had been before. Too much had happened for that, but it was honest in a way it hadn't been for years. Tommy took the divorce hard, as children always do, but he adapted with the resilience kids somehow managed to find. He started spending weekends with me regularly, and I discovered what a joy it was to have a relationship with my grandson that wasn't filtered through his parents' agendas. We worked on his science projects together. I taught him to cook some of his grandfather's favorite recipes, and he helped me learn to use some of the technology I'd been avoiding. It turned out that having a 10-year-old around made me feel younger, not older. The house, which had felt so empty and burdensome when George and Jessica were pressuring me to leave it, became vibrant again. Richard helped me tackle some of the larger maintenance projects I'd been putting off, not because I couldn't handle them myself but because it was more fun to do them together. We painted the guest bedroom a cheerful yellow and turned it into an art studio where I could work on my watercolors. The garden, which I'd been maintaining but not really enjoying, became a source of pleasure again as I planned new plantings and redesigned some of the flower beds. Most importantly, I rediscovered who I was outside of my roles as wife and mother. For 40 years I'd defined myself primarily through my relationships to other people. Robert's wife, George's mother, my student's teacher. There's nothing wrong with those roles, and I'd been fulfilled by them. But losing Robert and having George pull away had left me feeling like I didn't exist independently of them. Learning to see myself as Elizabeth, not Elizabeth the widow or Elizabeth the aging mother, just Elizabeth, was like coming home to myself after a long absence. A year and a half after that confrontation in my living room, I got a call from Jessica. I almost didn't answer when I saw her name on my phone, but curiosity got the better of me. "Elizabeth," she said, and her voice sounded different, smaller somehow. I was wondering if we could talk. We met at the same cafe where George and I had reconciled, though this conversation was very different. Jessica looked older, more tired, and there was none of the predatory calculation I'd grown accustomed to seeing in her eyes. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "A real one. Not the fake ones I used to give when I got caught doing something I shouldn't have." She told me about her childhood, about growing up in a family where love was conditional on performance, and where financial security was always precarious. She'd learned early that people were resources to be managed rather than relationships to be cherished, and she brought that perspective into her marriage without really examining it. When I met George, I saw someone who came from stability, from a family that had resources and security, she said. "I thought if I could just manage everything correctly, I could guarantee that Tommy would never experience the kind of uncertainty I grew up with. But somewhere along the way, managing became manipulating, and I lost track of the difference between protecting my family and victimizing yours. It wasn't a complete absolution, some wounds are too deep for that, but it was honest in a way that felt genuine." Jessica was in therapy too, working on the insecurities and control issues that had driven her behavior. She didn't ask for forgiveness, which I appreciated, but she did ask if there might someday be a possibility of rebuilding some kind of relationship for Tommy's sake. "I can't promise anything," I told her honestly. "Trust takes time to rebuild, and some damage can't be undone. But I'm willing to see how things go. That was 2 years ago. Today I'm 64 years old, and I've never felt more alive or more myself. Richard and I were married last spring in a small ceremony in my garden, surrounded by friends I've made through my volunteer work and the various activities I've gotten involved in. George walked me down the aisle, and Tommy was our ring bearer, and even Jessica attended, sitting quietly in the back with genuine happiness on her face. The foundation I established in Roberts and my name has provided scholarships for 37 students so far, helping adult learners complete their educations and build better lives for themselves and their families. Watching those graduation ceremonies, seeing the faces of people who've been given a second chance at their dreams, I know I made the right choice about my will. I still live in the same house where Robert and I raised George, but it's not a mausoleum anymore. It's a home again, filled with laughter and dinner parties and holiday celebrations. Richard's grandchildren visit regularly, and they've become like family to me. Tommy spends summers with us, and I love watching him grow into a thoughtful, kind young man who treats people with respect regardless of their age or circumstances. The most surprising thing about this whole experience is how much I've learned about my own strength. For so long after Robert died, I thought I was diminished somehow, that losing him meant losing the best parts of myself. But what I discovered is that the person I was with him, the competent, confident, loving woman who built a life and raised a family and contributed to her community, that person didn't disappear when he died. She was just buried under grief and other people's assumptions about what widowhood meant. Sometimes I think about that Sunday dinner when Jessica called me expired goods, and I'm almost grateful it happened. Not because I enjoyed being hurt and humiliated, but because it was the wake-up call I needed to stop accepting other people's definitions of who I was and what I was worth. It forced me to choose between the comfortable path of letting others manage my life and the harder path of reclaiming my autonomy. I chose myself, and that choice led to a life richer and more fulfilling than anything I could have imagined when I was sitting in that dining room feeling small and worthless and defeated. The house that Jessica thought I should give up because it was too much for a woman my age has become the center of a vibrant social life. The money she thought I was wasting by maintaining my independence has funded educational opportunities for dozens of people who might never have had the chance otherwise. The woman she dismissed as expired goods turned out to have quite a lot of value after all. Not that I need external validation anymore. I know who I am now and I know what I'm worth. I'm a woman who loved deeply and was loved in return. I'm a mother who raised a good man, even if it took him a while to remember how to be one. I'm a teacher who spent decades opening minds and changing lives. I'm a friend, a wife, a step-grandmother, a volunteer, an artist, a gardener, a reader, a thinker, a fighter when I need to be. I am not expired goods. I am vintage wine, complex, valuable, and getting better with age. And if anyone suggests otherwise, well, they're about to find out just how quickly this vintage can turn to vinegar when properly motivated. People often ask me if I regret the confrontation with George and Jessica, if I wish I'd handled things differently or more gently. The truth is, I regret that it was necessary. I regret that my son learned to see me as something to be managed rather than someone to be respected. I regret that my daughter-in-law thought cruelty was an acceptable tool for getting what she wanted. I regret that my grandson had to witness the breakdown of his family. But I don't regret standing up for myself. I don't regret reclaiming my life and my dignity and my autonomy. I don't regret showing everyone, including myself, that a 62-year-old widow is not automatically a victim waiting to be rescued or managed or disposed of. The morning after I changed my locks and updated my will, I woke up in my own house, in my own bed, surrounded by my own choices, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years: pride. Not the kind of pride that comes from accomplishments or recognition, but the quiet, steady pride that comes from knowing you've honored yourself and your values, even when it was difficult. That feeling has only grown stronger over the years. Every morning when I wake up in this house I love, next to this man who sees me as an equal partner rather than a burden to be managed, in this life I've consciously chosen and actively created, I feel that same quiet pride. I am not expired goods. I never was. And thanks to that awful dinner conversation and everything that followed, I'll never forget that again. Some lessons come wrapped in pain, but they're still worth learning. Some growth happens only when we're forced to defend ourselves. Some strength is discovered only when we're pushed beyond what we thought we could endure. Jessica thought she was putting me in my place that night when she called me expired goods. What she actually did was remind me that I get to decide what my place is. And my place, it turns out, is anywhere I choose to be. These days I choose to be exactly where I am. In my own home, living my own life on my own terms. Not because anyone else thinks it's appropriate for a woman my age, but because it's what makes me happy and fulfilled and proud of who I've become. And if that's not worth fighting for, I don't know what is.